First of all, tell you about Christian, who will be speaking first, who is the co-founder and board chair of the Canadian Positive People Network, and was a board member of GMP Plus at the time of Living 2016, which is what we're going to be discussing a lot about today. Christian has been living with HIV since 2003, successfully treated for hepatitis C in 2011. He has served as a board member at the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development, ICAD. As a PLHAV activist, Christian strongly advocates for the human rights and greater and more meaningful involvement of people living with HIV. His work at the Asian Community AIDS Services and the Committee for Accessible AIDS Treatment has allowed him to work with the ethno-racial and immigrant, refugee and non-status PLHIV communities in Ontario, Canada. And really it's over to you now, Christian, for your presentation.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to say thank you, ICAD and Robin, for inviting me to take part in this webinar. It's really an honor and privilege to be able to take part to report back what I've learned at Living 2016 as part of the steering committee and program committee working group member. And before I start, I'm located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And so I just want to also acknowledge that I live on and continue to benefit of the resources and lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, and as a person living with HIV and following the lines of the support of the Canadian government as well, I feel it's really important that we as a global community to really start looking into how we can stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and communities worldwide as they are disproportionately affected by HIV here locally in Canada as well as worldwide due to many of the structural oppressions that they face. Okay, so I'm going to just start by also letting you know that a little about living. So since 1986, the International AIDS Conferences always had meetings for people living with HIV as a means for them to really come together and solidify the activist movement and to identify common priorities. The living conferences that took place, the one in 2016 in Durban, is the third Positive Leadership Summit, and that follows the first one that was held in Mexico City in 2008, and the second one in Washington, D.C. in 2012. And as you notice, these Positive Leadership Summit takes place every 4 years. And then also before I start, I just want to also thank some of the major donors, including the Canadian government as well, who was a major sponsor to Living. Also USAID, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, the Global Fund, World Health Organization, the International HIV/AIDS Alliance, and UNAIDS, as well as GMP Plus is the lead secretariat to lead the convening of Living 2016. Also want to thank the local fundraising efforts that was done by ICAD, ICASO, CPPN, Global Network of People Living with HIV North America, and our North American delegate to the NGO delegation to the UNAIDS PCB Programming Board for reaching out to the Canadian government to support Living. As well, this event was really a group collaborative effort, so also want to give a shout out to all the Living 2016 steering committee members as well as program working group members. Okay, so today I just wanted to give a quick report back of Living. I know that GMP Plus will be releasing a final report in the near future, I think. So, I'm going to try to be brief and just give you some background contextual information as well as the purpose and outcomes. And as you can see, who attended Living 2016, so from the infographics, we see that 258 people living with HIV from across the globe, representing 68 countries, attended the event. A majority of participants came from the African continent for a very good reason that, the AIDS conference took place in South Africa this year. You would also see that there's a bit of a gender analysis. So of all the participants, there were 15 trans participants and about a little less than half of women who participated. In terms of age range, I would say a majority of them were in between the ages of 30 to 39, and then we have a younger age group of 17 to 29, 61 participants from that age group, and also 64 participants from the 40 to 49. So we have a pretty good mix of age distribution. And lastly, we had within the 2 days, we have 41 workshops. So it's actually been a really quite labor intensive, but also really well-rounded amounts of workshops and panel discussions being able to, that have been provided for the attendees in this pre-conference. And in terms of North American statistics, we have about 31 participants coming from North America, of which 12 of them came from Canada. So the objectives of Living. As I mentioned earlier, Living is really to provide a venue for people living with HIV globally to come together to re-energize the movement that we live in on a daily basis as our realities. Every 4 years, we really have this safer space where we can come together and really formulate some of our priorities that mean the most important and meaningful, crucial kind of ways for us to move forward, given that, we live in a movement where there's shrinking space of civil society, with funding cuts, with also issues such as lack of access to treatment across the globe. So these are really many things that we actually, I hope we could have more opportunities to come together aside from once every 4 years. And part of the objectives for Living is that through this space, we can come together and distill some of the feedback and priorities. So the global HIV response can be led also by a PLHIV-led kind of a response. And okay, so in terms of the pre-conference, for those who participated in the event, you will remember the opening panel. There was a question about that was asked to participants: are we in a movement in crisis, or are we in a movement of opportunity? And I think, I kind of said in the last slide that there are so many different considerations in terms of funding, treatment access, human rights violations, and also, the local and global kind of realities that we must actually live in. And also in terms of the advances in science, such as neurotechnologies, including PrEP, the HIV movement is changing and continues to change. And I think, the question is, within the structures that we are living under, how can we actually adapt and face some of the crises that we have to deal with within the past few years and since the beginning of the movement, and really transform them as opportunities. And the 5 areas of the summit programs included access to qualities and rights-based services, stigma, discrimination, and criminalization and violence, access to treatment, including funding realities, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and then also GPA, the greater involvement of people living with HIV. So in terms of each of the themes, I don't have time to really go through all of them, so I'm just going to make a few highlights. In terms of the access to quality and rights-based services, some of the discussion included the need for increased treatment literacy, and some of the outcomes was noted that it's important and essential that people living in HIV and key populations be involved in the development of these treatment guidelines, because if through meaningful involvement, the uptake of these guidelines and would be better. And it's really important for us who are taking treatment on a daily basis to actually understand how we can, take advantage of these treatments and how they affect our bodies. In terms of some of the discussions, how we can build resilient community systems of health. And I think part of the discussions and recommendations got focused on how there's need for a mentorship within our community of activism, of especially people living with HIV activists. How are those knowledge being transferred from an older generation of more experienced activists to a newer generation of younger activists? And in terms of how we can actually empower people living with HIV to educate, to really take part in the knowledge dissemination of the newer kind of prevention technologies or treatment or newer science as an integral part of our response. In terms of stigma and discrimination, there were some interactive workshops as well as panels. One dealt with self-stigma, and that was one of the panels I was able to help facilitate, and we actually utilized an experiential activity called the Exclusion Circle that we have gotten permission to use from the Committee for Accessible AIDS Treatment here locally. So it's good that we have been able to kind of provide some of the local knowledges that we used here and shared it with our fellow peers at Living 2016. We also had some presentations around the stigma index, which I'm sure Julian later can talk more about, and it's really about utilizing research to document stigma and human rights violations and really how we can turn them into advocacy tools. And also some of the discussion really revolve around how we can address some of the human rights violations, including criminalization that are faced by not only people living with HIV, but other key populations, including people who use drugs, people who perform sex work, etc. And for access to treatment, if for all of you who kind of followed the Global Fund replenishment, Canada held the 5th replenishment back in September last year, and we were able to raise, give or take, 13 billion US, around that ballpark figure, considering the currency exchange rate. And in terms of the discussion, I think for people living with HIV, we came to the common understanding that it's really important for us to understand how intellectual property rights and issues work and how our country is being funded, especially given that many countries are transitioning out of the Global Fund and will face issues related to access to treatment. And in terms of one of the recommendations is how can we actually create a framework where access to treatment can be linked to more of a social justice framework as opposed to more of economic framework. And the last two topics, so SRHR, sexual, reproductive, and health rights. So this was a very important component, and especially recently, UNAIDS has released new SRHR guidelines for women and girls. So, within the HIV sector, I think, just being able to address the epidemic through a really gender equity lens is very important. And some of the recommendations came out, included how can we have holistic programming that really involve women, trans women, as well as, youth, and how can we ensure that people living in HIV and youth can really can shape these kind of sexual health and reproductive health rights services and programming, as well as strategies. So one also key recommendation was how can global networks such as GMP Plus and ICW, the International Community of Women living with HIV, as well as other global networks, really come together to build common strategies and agendas. And lastly, for GPA-MIPA, so the the greater involvement of people living with HIV, and I think some of the discussions or recommendations centered around how can people living in HIV become really meaningfully be engaged, be it through peer delivery support or capacity building, through mentorship, or if we're engaged in the global kind of movement and discourse, how can we ensure that we are accountable to the constituents that we represent? And also being able to address HIV from an intersectional lens as well. So aside from us just being people living in HIV, what are some of the other oppressions that we face, such as, we mentioned about gender, we talked about certain identities of such as people who use drugs, or people who perform sex work, or are indigenous kind of identities. So being able to really think about how we can enhance GPA through an intersectional lens has been discussed. Lastly, okay, so in terms of the key outcomes, I think overall the participants gave very good review of living. 91% of the respondents were very satisfied or satisfied about the summit, and 70% felt the summit had really fulfilled expectations about the outputs. And I think most participants really value that the summit served as a safer space for people living with HIV to convene on a regular basis to discuss some of these global priorities. In terms of the key outcomes, GMP Plus will utilize some of these feedback and come out with 5 priorities or efficacy papers. And that's something that I think Julian can speak on more in the future. And lastly, I know my time is up, so if you have any questions, you can, about Living in 2016 or GMP Plus, you can go to their website or contact them by their email. Also for the other organization, including the Canadian Positive People Network, the Global Network of People Living with HIV North America, which is the North American PLHIV network consisting of members from Canada and the US, as well as ICAD, the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christian. And I apologize for having to cut you off the way that I did. It's one of the pitfalls of an online platform. There aren't very nice timekeeping tools. But thank you very much for a really very comprehensive presentation. At this moment, we're going to scan the crowd. Are there any clarifying questions from folks about Christian's talk? If so, please do raise your hand using the button icon at the top of your screen. or please feel free to do a text message in the chat box in the lower right-hand corner. We'll just give folks a few minutes to raise their hands. Wonderful. And I think, Christian, you know, that very thorough talk that you provided, the summary of the Living Conference, will definitely help to spark our conversations following Javier's presentation as well. So thank you very much. It was a great starter. I see Trevor is writing, "This is a good time to stand up and pressure UNAIDS to reinstall an analyst for IP." Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. Let's come back to that following Javier's presentation. Oh, Trevor says the PCB NGO delegation is pressuring them to do that. So Trevor, that's really great to hear. Perhaps you can share with us a little bit more following Javier's presentations to let us know how we can support the NGO delegation to the PCB in this advocacy work and lobbying work that you are doing. Okay. All right, Julian, over to you.
Okay, well, I'm not going to add anything to what was a very diverse and very in-depth presentation, except to say that one of the joys of being at a meeting like that, where people are coming together from all over the world, that sometimes it's also not about the report or about the policy papers that come out sometimes afterwards. It was obvious to see that there were lobbying, linking and sharing that was going on from far-flung corners of the world, which has already resulted in alliances and pieces of work being done. So I think that's the other side of that of that richness of bringing people together. But I'm going to move swiftly on to Javier Bellocq, who is going to talk how this fits into the HLM, a high-level meeting on AIDS. Javier Bellocq is from Argentina. He has an academic background in communication and journalism. His work began in the HIV sector as a counsellor at a local NGO when he was diagnosed in 1988. In 1992, he started his work with the broader HIV movement in Argentina and in Latin America and the Caribbean. In 1995, he joined the GM board for the first time, and over nearly a 10-year period since then was instrumental in mobilizing positive people in more than 10 countries and creating national HIV associations in countries where there had been none, or very, very fragile ones. He is a former board member of the Global Fund of AIDS, TB and Malaria. In 2003, he joined the International HIV/AIDS Alliance, where he served first as the Latin American and Caribbean regional rep and head of influence until the end of 2016. He came back to GMP under our new structure and is currently the chair of the GMP board. He's also on the International Steering Committee of the Robert Carr Civil Society Networks Fund and the Civil Society rep in the Global Fund Latin America and Caribbean Board Delegation. Hola, Javier, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the presentation, Julian. Sorry, Deborah, for the acronym. I will introduce the acronym, but it's a opportunistic infection in the HIV/AIDS world that we overuse acronym, and we should not. So let's start by the high-level meeting. I mean, this is the first acronym. It's about giving a bit of an overview and a sort of evaluation on the experience from the civil society perspective of the Civil Society Task Force, which is the second acronym below GMP+. And that has to do with experience, which I think both the International AIDS Conference and the Living 2016, as well as the high level, are the two key milestones or moments that shaped the global agenda in the last year. So that's why I think there is, of course, interconnections, and it's very important. So the process in January 2016, and I outlining the process because it's very important, because high-level meetings will continue to happen, as well as basically next in 2018 there will be the high-level meeting on tuberculosis. So processes and lessons learned are always important. So in January 2016 there was establishment of the Civil Society Task Force. The Civil Society Task Force first met in February face-to-face. One of the main tasks for the Civil Society Task Force of the high-level meeting on AIDS, which this is an event that took place in June, was to organize a civil society hearing. High-level meetings, as well as for those people who are not aware with all this jargon, high-level meetings it's a process or a mechanism by the UN to bring together member states and technical people and civil society to discuss some concrete topic, as well as the UN General Assembly on a certain topic, like the UNGAS on HIV/AIDS of 2001. The high-level meetings are meeting that happens after usually an UNGAS to follow up on progress and recommit member states for future steps and actions and commitment, financial commitments, etc. So in 2006 there was a high-level meeting on HIV and AIDS, followed by another one in 2011. So in 2011 was agreed as part of the commitment to have a high-level meeting 10 years later. So that's this intro bring us into this important meeting for the AIDS response that happened last year. All the high-level meetings, the same will apply for the 2018 TV high-level meeting, have a civil society task force. And the way the civil society task force operates is basically to prepare the civil society hearing, the involvement of civil society across the process, as well as the involvement of civil society in the high-level meeting itself, which happens last June. Even we start working in January, 6 months to prepare at least the civil society side of the high-level meeting is really a spin. It's really impossible. So one of the lessons learned and what we are advising to our colleagues working on TV to start earlier and to put pressure on the President of the General Assembly Office and the UN Secretary General to start the process of a high-level meeting with more than 6 months. This is the composition of the Civil Society Task Force, and I think Trevor is with us today. And we do have the gift of having a Civil Society Task Force Secretariat, which was the work done by ICAD with Marianne and Melissa, people that I'm sure you know, as well as UNAIDS, and we have Chris Collins in Geneva and Eric Sawyer in New York, who were basically both the UNAIDS and ICAD our best allies and fixers and supporters. And there is, if you see the list of people in the task force, there is a lot of balance, including the representation of key populations like transgender, indigenous population, gay and MSM, sex workers, etc. And this civil society task force was co-chaired by Marama Pala and myself. Of course, one of the lessons learned and happens in committees and etc. What happened even in a short spin of 6 months, not all the members participate. When we bring all the members, and Trevor can speak about that, when we bring all the members together, we see each other around the table for 2 days and people were more engaged. On the weekly virtual meetings was a challenge. And we have probably half of the task force really engaging, by the way, including Trevor, who basically help us a lot to understand, together with Marama, issues about indigenous population and engaging with Canada. So, lesson learned from the Civil Society Task Force. As I said, it's a very short time, at 6 months, to organize, in general, the high-level meeting, but in particular, the engagement of civil society. Having a civil society network as a secretary is key. In this case, was ICASO for the future. It's always good. Of course, we work very well with UNAIDS, and they have been our allies, but the UNAIDS are more inclined or pushed to respond to the requirements of member states. So more acronym, UNH, well, you know, PGA is the President of the General Assembly and the Secretary General of the UN, are very important. You will not basically sit with the UN Secretary General, but the Secretary General will appoint a senior advisor where you have been discussing with. As happens with all the committees, having only money or resources for one face-to-face meeting is not advisable. And for few people, the few people who actually really get involved virtually and face-to-face is becoming like a close to the deadlines, like April and June, like a full-time job. What we like especially about the broader civil society engagement, that there was a parallel process, not necessarily linked to us, which were different organizations creating position papers. Well, for example, the 10 Civil Society Point for Actions now, that was, I think, facilitated by ICAD, but signed off by many, many organizations and networks. The civil society response to the draft 0 of the political declaration of this high-level meeting. There were so many specific civil society position papers on concrete things related to indigenous population, gay and MSM, key populations, things like that, which sometimes were published and sometimes were handouts that was distributed in the corridors and in the meeting rooms of the UN. One of the main challenges we faced was the vetoes. Some countries, some governments, basically opposed to a significant number of people invited to the high-level meeting. So this was a huge scandal and a distraction, because we, as a task force, said that we have zero tolerance to people not allowed to fly into New York and participate in the high-level meeting. More or less, this has been fixed, and most of the people who were vetoed actually being able to go to New York, and we have a special session in Ford Foundation to give them the space to share the experience and the issues. Some of the lessons learned is that what happened in a high-level meeting and in a very complex political declaration exercise is that becoming a very long shopping list. Not too many issues and too many paragraphs are becoming basically repetitive on the same issue. What happens with this very bold and wonderful international documents that lack of focus and become like if you have the opportunity to read the final document approved, it's an endless document with some paragraphs that basically repeat among each other. And there is also some gaps which are not good. What happens is the too many issues and the repetitive and the shopping list is also a symptom of a lack of coordination. And some agendas are contradictory. And I'm not referring within the HIV/AIDS movement. What happened is some organizations on different topics related or linked to HIV see in the high-level meeting the opportunity to bring some of their own issues. And if I put it in inverted commas, trying to be as polite as possible, there was a moment where the discussion and the negotiation from the civil society front was hijacked in some way by different agendas which are not necessarily priority for HIV. And that could be, I don't know, comprehensive sexual education, which of course is very important for HIV and HIV response and being included in a high-level meeting political declaration. There are so many other issues that also are competing priorities. So this was one lesson learned, and in the future I think we should do better in terms of not trying to build a more common and comprehensive agenda before the spin of 6 months. So, as I said, when you translate the competing agendas and the contradictions into advocacy, then you end in briefing ambassadors, because basically the whole negotiation of a high-level meeting happens with the special missions of all the countries, all the member states in New York. So then one show up on Monday to speak with the ambassador from Peru or from Australia with a line, with a message to advocate and influence him or her. And the next day comes someone different from civil society. So of course, that creates some tensions. In some of the missions, you have people that are qualified to do that. In other cases, if you have someone who comes with a different messages, they take this as an opportunity to basically ignore all the civil society inputs. So we did have a week in May of sort of a advocacy week where an important and very comprehensive group of civil society members visit all the embassies, special missions, and talk to the technical people who were engaged in the negotiation of the draft political declaration. But we still have in the big elephant in the rooms where the competing agendas or what comes as a priority or not. And of course that's confused the negotiators, and also put us in a weakest position when it comes to more difficult discussions. Of course, the outcome of the political declaration have a lot of positive things. I'm sure you can access the presentation later. But of course, they have a strong reference to human rights, increased attention on adolescent and young people, more specific and explicit to address HIV among children, stronger commitment on HIV among women and girls, including recognition of the connection with gender-based violence and HIV. This is things you can now find in the political declaration. Explicit positive reference to harm reduction, consistent attention to stigma and discrimination, things that has been also mentioned by Christian as key priority issues discussed in the Living 2016. Commitment of 6% of funding for civil society among the overall financial commitment. We will see how that looks like or works in the following years. And finally, but not less important, since Trevor mentioned the IPs, the intellectual property issue, there was a recognition of the need to use existing trade flexibility. So this, if you know all the resistance and agendas of the member state, there are a lot of good things within the political declaration. Of course, there are also gaps that needs to be worked. And they also, the final declaration, show a sort of progressive forward-looking agenda, which, as I said, have a lot to do with rights, but also, for the second time in one of these UN documents, you have all the key populations, name it. There is an articulate commitment to address all the forms of discrimination and human rights. There is a call for review the law for a law reform in countries where the law are criminalizing people, and of course the commitment for comprehensive sexual education and other things who are cross-cutting or related to HIV and AIDS. I mean, if you see that, this is perfect. The language within the document was quite difficult to digest because they put the emphasis in people who are most at risk and use a lot of risk language, which in some way contradict the forward-looking agenda I just mentioned. If you have the opportunity to see the political declaration, why I'm advocating to see the political declaration? Because it's an advocacy tool for now until the next whatever high-level meeting, ANGAS, or political international agreement on HIV and AIDS. You could hold accountable all the member states on all this list of things you see in the screen, from human rights to finance, from IP, intellectual property, and access to key populations. This is very, very important because many organizations' advocacy roadmap is based on the political declaration and how we can translate this into action. As I said, sorry to say it so many times, we face challenges about competing, especially with non-HIV agendas, whatever that non-HIV agenda means. But if we work together more proactively in the future, we can better link what so-called non-HIV agendas with that. Some missions and member states have been approaches from different sides with different agendas, contradicting or challenging organizations of key populations or HIV, which in some way weaken our possibility to negotiate. As I said, we are walking to a high-level meeting with poor targets. We improve a bit of that. Poor targets is the government's committed to mobilize whatever 17-24 billion for the HIV response, including the Global Fund allocation. Things like that. That took us 6 months of fight to get some decent targets into the political declaration. short time. AIDS fatigue, I mean, it's not the same thing to have an ANGAS in 2001 than a high-level meeting in 2016, with all the migrant crises and things that have been happening at the same time. It's becoming difficult, especially when member states put a veto on MSM leaders from Africa to support the Southern leadership, and to also make understand our beloved friends and colleagues from, in inverted commas, Northern NGOs, that it is important to enable the meaningful participation from civil society across the world. And it was a challenge for many people to access to New York and to the US, and I'm sure that in the future will be becoming more challenging. So next steps, and I'm finishing with that, is that in the future, those people who work on HIV at the regional and global level, we think that the first thing we can do is follow up on the commitment that at country level. You take the political declaration and go back to your government and hold them accountable, because the political declaration was unanimous approved, apart from the representative of the Vatican state. But apart from that, all the countries approved the political declaration. It was a consensus document. Also, monitoring and do the accountability national events to put pressure on governments. We acknowledge the things that are weak in the political declaration, but some of the speeches of member states, ministers, prime ministers, and people who went to New York in June were more stronger than the political declaration, so you could follow up or hold governments accountable to their speeches. This is a clear case in many Latin American countries. And of course, start thinking of how you link other high-level meetings and ANGAS, like the ANGAS in drugs that happens after the high-level meeting, as well as the incoming high-level meeting on tuberculosis. So probably I speak about a lot of abstraction, but I think it's very important that from Canada to Argentina and the rest of the world, we use these very expensive and fancy events in the around the world for something. I will rewrite my email in the chat because I did it last night in Bangkok with 12 hours jet lag. So this is not my email, but I will rewrite it. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your answers and have a conversation.
Well, thank you, Javier. That was a lot of stuff to get into that number of slides. Before we move on to a general discussion, are there any clarifying things or questions to Javier? And once again, if you could either raise your hand, and I can't see any raised hands yet, or right in the bottom of the bottom right-hand corner, and very usefully, if you look in the chat that's been made to everyone, Richard, thank you, Richard, has put the UNAIDS reference group on HIV and human rights, and some of the documents surrounding that, and also also there have been the medicines patents pool prioritization report targeting, has the link to that has been put in by Christian, and we will certainly put them in the little sheet that goes out after this. But I'm giving a moment or two for questions of clarity. Trevor has raised his hand, so Trevor needs to be unmuted, I think. If somebody can do that, where it's you can unmute yourself, I think, Trevor,
yes.
If you want the floor. Yeah, go for it.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit, and the reason I brought up IP issues, intellectual property right issues, is really because that seems to be one of the lightning rods where civil society in the coming years, I think that's one of the hills that we need to fight and die on. if you want to use militaristic language like risk and vulnerability. You know, it's quite right. I saw that too, Javier, where civil society seemed to be not all on the same page. And as we do this integration thing and invite more people into the HIV family and global architecture, you know, and especially, you know, during this period where the space for civil society all around the world is shrinking. Canada seems to be one of the exceptions to that rule, but that's no guarantee that there's not going to be a backlash here as well. And as this happens, you know, UNAIDS is going through a funding crisis, and there's a global review panel looking at the operating model, hacking and figuring out where to get more efficiencies, as they call it. Well, one efficiency was eliminating the intellectual property rights analyst position at UNAIDS, which, you know, if it's currently in the world, we keep saying getting to zero, 90, 90, 90, and yet half the people in the world with HIV do not have access to treatment, and that's completely unacceptable. And rather than, you know, this fast track strategy, we seem to be backtracking. So I'd say in you know, and these shrinking spaces and you know, we've been demanding more and more support for advocacy, because when we start getting funding, you know, we're loud mouths, and then they throw money at us and say, okay, implement. Then it's all about warm butts and seats and evaluating processes, and no one has time for that crucial advocacy piece. So I would say, you know, it really does get me excited, because there's a real opportunity here to reinvigorate the response, the civil society response. So I would encourage us to find our common ground and to choose, you know, a few of these lightning rods where we could really concentrate our efforts and get the biggest bang for our buck, and go after the member states to support our issues. So that's my little plug there. Sorry to take up.
Thanks, Trevor. I think that's a really, really important point. And if I can just kind of build off of that, looking at our roadmap forward for the next 12 months to 18 months ahead, and this is a question to everybody, but I'm going to pose it to our two featured speakers, but looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on that. How can we use the more immediate forums to our advantage in terms of advancing the issues that have been raised today, and as entry points to advance these discussions with multilaterals, with governments, with partners and stakeholders? So in particular, I'm thinking about the real immediate, which is in May, the International Harm Reduction Conference, but also importantly is the UN gathering in July with a review of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the importance of the fact that it's in July, and only in July, that the health goal, where HIV falls, is going to be reviewed. This is the only time before 2020, when we're talking about the fast track targets in the 90-90-90, it's going to come to discussion within the UN. So what kind of advocacy, what kind of gathering, what kind of preparation do we need to do, and that is already underway, that we can engage with?
Javier? Okay, I agree. I think that all what you mentioned is very important to have in mind, but there is something else, which in some way, I mean, it's interesting what Trevor says, because we have last June a very bold political declaration and a commitment of fully funding the HIV response, at least in the words of the political declaration, and then the unplug, in inverted commas, unplug UNAIDS. So that's, you know, the difference between rhetoric and action and signing checks. But the other point is that, linked to UNAIDS and linked to the Global Fund current discussion, we are now facing the Global Fund transitioning as a major donor on HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria. They're transitioning out of middle-income countries. So basically, in some way, this is a huge threat, and we see some rebound of epidemics in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, to mention Romania as a country. But it's also an opportunity to start discussing sustainability, because transitioning is a mechanism where the Global Fund exit, let's say, less traumatically or with less guilt or exposure, political exposure. But I think I would try to link this with the discussion of the intellectual property. I'm coming from a region where we do have a lot of middle-income countries that eventually, in the medium term, could pay for their own HIV response, treatment, and prevention. Not probably governments that are willing to pay for civil society, which is a different discussion. But some of the small countries, let's, for example, mention El Salvador in Central America, or Nicaragua, or Costa Rica, the economy of scales that they procure ARVs, viral load, CD4, etc., is so small that they don't have any power to negotiate prices. So the role of UNAIDS, the role of the Global Fund, or WHO, PAHO, etc., on trying to make those treatments and testing kits, etc., affordable, is the answer to the long-term sustainability. We know that we will not get money from ODA and from the Global Fund for El Salvador, Costa Rica, or Peru in the following years, and we need to transition and we need to become sustainable. But there are so many things related to sustainability. One thing is how you continue funding civil society, but the other thing is how you can procure affordable medicines and other equipment. And I think this is also linked to the SDG July meeting, where when we're discussing sustainability, universal health coverage, etc., prices and intellectual property becoming a very relevant discussion too. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely agree. Yep. Christian, I'm going to hand it over to you for your thoughts on the issue.
Robin, did you say me? Hello?
Yeah, all yours.
Okay, sorry. I just have a little audio issue. So I'm just going to talk a little more, perhaps, within the Canadian and maybe trying to bridge it to the global context as well. So, you know, recently, last week in Canada, there has been a national stakeholder meeting that was held, convened by the Public Health Agency of Canada on STBBI, so sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections, which includes also discussions around HIV and hepatitis C. And I think why I'm linking this is because I think often locally in Canada, and I want to thank ICAD for, you know, being the national partner that really helps build those platforms for discussion, linking the local movement with the global response. I think for us to address, you know, some of the issues that Javier has said, how can we really press for affordable medications, really move towards having universal health coverage. These are actually issues that, you know, we as Canadians living in a higher income country actually do have to face in terms of how, you know, until very recently, you know, in certain provinces, we don't get access to certain medications, such as the higher price direct acting agents for hepatitis C, and also, you know, in terms of access to PrEP, not all the provinces actually have them listed on the public formulary. And I think it's important for us to actually locally within Canada to think about, look at how our inequities that are facing us in different kind of communities, let's say for the indigenous communities, or you know, lack of health infrastructures in rural communities. How do these issues get played out, and how actually we can form a common platform so that we can actually hold our governments accountable to the promises that they have made. So in Canada, they have signed on to the 90-90-90 targets 2 years ago on World AIDS Day 2015. You know, Prime Minister Trudeau has hosted the Global Fund and really has set a tone for their Canadian commitment to end AIDS. So I think we need to work more closely in terms of how we hold our government accountable, and also being able to engage better in these global discussions, which I think this has been a really great opportunity for many of our Canadian peers to learn more about the discussions that's been taking place and really build a solidified front. So that's kind of my thoughts on the subject.
Great, thanks, Christian. I'm going to do a scan here. Any comments or questions from the group on the phone, on the computer with us online today? I see Richard is typing. Any other comments, hands, while Richard is typing his response? Trevor. Oh.
We have Trevor again, but perhaps before that happens, I mean, so we've talked a lot about 90-90-90, and I think one of the things that is very apparent from the work that that GMP does with partners around the globe is that 90-90-90 is, as we've all said, only going to work if civil society is actually financed to make sure that it happens and is placed and it's properly audited, and we can actually have the ability to be able to speak truth to power where, for example, a country in the EU only knows where 70% of the people living with HIV do not know their status because the government doesn't want to know, because it's signed up to 90-90-90. And at the moment, they're just struggling to put in place the ARV for the people that they've got. So to a certain extent, they don't want to know. And I think the second part of that is looking at perhaps there's a fourth 90. There is not yet a pill to take away stigma. And it's civil society that actually does the work on reducing stigma, both internalized and that is visited upon them. But those are just two thoughts, but let's give the floor over to the people who have got their hands up now.
All right, so Richard here has written, Robin, perhaps you can speak to opportunities you see for Canadian civil society organizations to engage with our government in advance of the July meeting, or indeed opportunities for civil society organizations elsewhere, given that there are a mix of participants from all neighborhoods around the world. So thanks, Richard. That's a really very important point. I'm going to throw it to our speakers, but in terms of, from a Canadian perspective, this is a role that ICAD has played for many, many years, a convening role for civil society organizations and communities to come together, to exchange positions, to share priorities, and to come together around a collective voice. That we also then engage the Canadian government, both the delegations as well as some of our key bureaucrats within the different departments, to have these kinds of conversations and exchanges. So that civil society has a direct voice or a direct opening to have a discussion with the government as they prepare their positions. It's funny that we're talking about the forum that happened last week here in Canada, as well as the funding priorities and the lack of funding for civil society organizations. Unfortunately, ICAD has had its funding not renewed for this activity that has been core to its mandate. It doesn't mean that we are not going to be identifying additional sources of funding to allow us to continue to do that. But in the immediate, our Canadian government has seen that as being less of a priority in its focus on the domestic response. We will continue to work with our global partners, including GMP+, our partners here in Canada, many of whom are on the line today, and with our partners such as ICASO, HealthGap, and so on, and we'll be actively outreaching to the government to reinstate this really important stream of funding. In terms of other opportunities for civil society organizations to engage, Javier and Christian, do you have, and Julian, any suggestions about how folks can get engaged as the world leads into the discussions and the review that's to happen in July in New York?
This is Christian. So maybe I'll just do it, answer very quickly at first. So, you know, for many of you who don't know the Canadian Positive People Network, we are still a very grassroots network that was formed only less than 2 years ago in May 2015, and we're still an unfunded network. So in terms of how we really try to engage our community, we have really relied on existing partners such as ICAD and other Canadian national partners to, you know, either build our infrastructure as a grassroots network, or being able to like really seek out common agendas to put forth as we advocate. So I think, you know, there's one thing about you know, being accountable to the needs of people living in HIV, but also working in concordance with all the great work of our community partners are doing as well. I think, you know, being located in Canada and North America, it is really a hope that, you know, GMP Plus as a global network of people living in HIV can really provide the technical support or assistance for different regions around the world. So, you know, they do have this expertise on how to, you know, advocate effectively within the global forum. And so I think, you know, just being able to see some of those strengthening of relationships between global networks and also the responses that's happening in the region, I think that's really the way to go. And that's my response.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Christian's and what you said, I mean, honestly, the future or the scenarios that we are seeing evolving in are not very positive. And one of the example, or let's say one of the tools to manage our response and engagement will be the resources, closing the tab. And I mean, I coming from experience working with an international NGO in the United Kingdom and stay there post-Brexit for a while, and knowing how things could get complicated. But I think this is probably the moment where we should all come together, even in a short time, because July meeting is really, really around the corner, and it's a more broader agenda. But it's the time where we can all need to come together, because we will have less and less resources for this global UN kind of work, which is setting the scene and committing member states. And of course, priorities will be handled by governments. In some cases, let's say, good governments. In other cases, horrible governments, administrations. So the whole landscape could dramatically change if the contribution from one of the major investor or contributor of the Global Fund, the U.S. government, definitely challenge their own appropriation decision law to contribute wide and set amount of money to PEPFAR, to the Global Fund, etc. So, I mean, and I mean focusing on funding, because this is the overarching basket where civil society will try to fight to grab the resources we need to do advocacy, intellectual property work, make the governments accountable, etc. So, honestly, I see this as a urgent call to work together. When I say work together, it's not only us who come from the HIV/AIDS work or world. It's also to engage with other movements that are related to the SDGs on health and other diseases, because if it's not, we will be ending only having virtual meetings among ourselves and not even being able to go to the capitals to influence all this madness process of UN, etc. And leaving the room for the more fanatic guys who do have the resources to influence the agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Javier. Any thoughts, questions, comments? I'm going to call on Trevor. I know that, oh, there you are. Trevor, over to you.
Okay, I just want to talk a little bit more around convening civil society around, this whole idea of what I would call almost the beginning of a war on civil society, or on our participation and engagement, and maybe democracy in general. But the NGO delegation to the UNAIDS PCB had a teleconference with members of the Global Fund community delegations and UNITAID, and we had a first discussion around that, and we've been talking about convening the different groups that contribute, so we kind of get on the same page, so that we're not coming across as competing narratives, shall we say. So the UNAIDS board next week, from the 6th till the 9th, will be in Washington. I'm sorry, the UNAIDS NGO delegation will be in Washington, D.C. to meet with the U.S. government and Ambassador Deborah Birx, who is one of the people who said that at the HLM last year that civil society seemed to her to be divided and not displaying as much solidarity. So there'll be more to talk about after that, and we will also be discussing the July review of the SDGs, and especially number 3 on health, with HIV buried deep down in there. So there will be more opportunities, but we have to do more than talking about meeting, and that's about that advocacy piece. Where is the funding for this advocacy? Where is the money going to come from to bring us together to have these discussions? Because it's not just the HIV sector and TB and malaria and HCV. It's all of civil society, and I think we would do well to get together with some of the other global and national movements to figure out exactly how are we going to fight back, basically. Thanks.
Thanks, Trevor. One of the ideas, there needs to be many discussions leading into July, but one of the ways that we can use that moment in New York is to hold side events, both that are government-sponsored, which we saw a number of governments interested in co-sponsoring together with civil society, important side events around the high-level meeting that took place last June. But really using this as an opportunity to draw the focus into this continued conversation with member states who will be present there. Other thoughts from folks on the line? Christian, I saw that you were writing furiously in the chat box. Oh, here it is.
Yeah, it is a little more specific to what was going on, but I think in terms of, I feel like governments right now, often they say they want to engage civil society or, people living with HIV or experiences or key priority populations, yet, in terms of how they're doing it, or their commitment often don't really align with what they say. So I think in terms of how we actually strategize and really being able to hold them accountable to the words. I think that's really something we need to focus on. And I think, for Javier, he spoke earlier that it's important for us to build those alliances, not just within HIV, but also broaden the scope so we can actually make those allyship with different kind of sectors. I think that's really important moving forward. But yet we also need to be careful not to have the government lose focus of HIV. I think in the meeting last week, even though the Canadian government has been interested in integrating HIV, hepatitis C, and sexually transmitted bloodborne infections, some of the sentiments I got from the room has been that, for integration, it may not really always be, it may not really truly work if we want to just focus on integrating how we address diseases, as opposed to how can we actually do better integration so we can address these epidemics, not only from a biomedical perspective, but also, be able to better address some of the structural kind of challenges and barriers, or, be able to integrate the kind of human rights framework within the work that we do. So I think that those kind of integration actually makes more sense to the community, and it's just being able to, for us to, I guess, convey this need to the government and have them be able to actually listen to us. I think that's kind of our goal for now, and hopefully that can, shift some of their current approach a bit.
Thanks, Christian. I think you would find many of us on the line in agreement with you. All right, folks, so it is 2:25. We have time for one final question or comment, and then we'll hand it over to our speakers to give their final thoughts. Any final questions or comments? All right, I see Jeff Potts from CPPN is typing. While Jeff is typing, are there any other questions from folks, perhaps from our UK colleagues or from the Netherlands or from other corners and neighborhoods of the world? All right. Well, thanks, Jeff. So he says, great job, everyone. Really glad that you convened this important update opportunity. Thanks so much, Jeff. All right, Jeff is he's typing at the moment. Any other final thoughts from the crowd who's with us on the online? All right, I'm going to hand it over then to Javier first, and then to Christian to share some final thoughts.
Thank you. I think that probably my final thought has been mentioned by Christian, how we managed to continue working to broaden the scope and bring many other people, especially under the roof of the SDGs, and where HIV/AIDS ended in the new SDGs, in the SDGs, sorry. So it's very important that we also use this opportunity, but how we strike the balance on keeping the approach of HIV/AIDS as an exceptional and unique health issue, and how that's related with structural barriers and things like that. So I think this is an open question. I think this is something we need to work, and I think the work together, the partnership with ICAD and GMP and others, and the networks at the global and regional level is a channel to continue this discussion. We will not find an answer in the next 3 minutes, but I think for me it's the main is the main reflection of today, that those spaces like Living 2016, the high-level meetings are needed more than ever. But there's also some of these windows closing, whether by governments or by the funding scenarios, etc. So more than ever, we need to be creative and find a way forward. Thank you for holding this webinar, and it has been a pleasure to chat with you today.
Can I just jump in for a minute before Christian? Because I think one of our really big challenges, in some ways, that we have been a victim of our own success. What I mean by that is that if you look at the number of people in the global north, but also in other places, who are now able to just get on with their lives, they have access to medication. They have been able to stop thinking of HIV as a death sentence and something which they have transitioned through. Now, we think about that, and then we think, how do we? And I think this is one of the really big challenges for us as a movement. How do we, as the global networks and those that work globally, reinvigorate people who at once were fighting for everybody because there was no access to pills, there was no access to treatment, and so there was an automatic solidarity with people around the world, who are now just getting on with their lives, because I think that we have lost an awful lot of the power and strength that comes from a global movement of solidarity, because there are now so many targets for us to hit, and we're not doing a very good job of translating that on the ground to enough people who are now just getting on with their lives. And maybe that's a really big question, but I think that that is one of the things that I think, and I know that we need to do when we think of the number of people who are just getting on with, are able to get on with their lives around the world, who no longer feel connected to a movement of global solidarity, which actually, and a global movement that could actually help us effect change and lobby on.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Julian. And I guess I'll be really quick. I think, that's a really great point. And I think, for us being in Canada, how can we actually engage more in these global dialogues and, advocate and build on a common agenda? I think, Julian, you raised a very good point between, some of the differences between the realities of people living in higher resource countries and also lower resource countries, especially in terms of treatment access or whatnot. Yet, I think, just a reminder that those inequities do still exist greatly in Canada. And I think, just for us who are living here, let's say, and I'm talking about the Canadian perspective because I am part of the Canadian network, that, how are some of the challenges that we face, how are they linked within the global context? And how can we actually build those a common language? So I'm just going to share one of the teachings that one of the elders from the Toronto area that shared with me. She said, oftentimes we should actually focus on the commonalities. So despite of all the many kind of differences and considerations that we do not want to dismiss for sure, how can we actually build a more stronger movement for people living in HIV, or kind of a common front for all the community-based organizations, NGOs working within HIV, so that we actually have more of a bargaining power when we actually reach out to the funders or whatnot, because we need to have a strong front as we face the challenges ahead. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Christian. And thanks, Javier. And thanks, Julian. And thanks to everybody who's been on the line with us. I think it's become clear, very, very loud and clear, that this kind of forum is very, very valuable and something that we need to do more of and ensure that happens on a more frequent basis, particularly as we are leading into these important gatherings that are going to take place over the next couple of months. So please stay tuned. It's been wonderful to have you all with us. I am going to hand it over to Julian to talk about some of the next steps, in particular around the advocacy papers and keeping us all engaged with one another.
Thank you. I mean, so I think, yes, as I was saying, that the next steps, yes, there are going to be reports. Yes, there is going to be advocacy papers. But let's look at those things as things which are a discussion. They're the beginning of a discussion in a community rather than books from the Bible, because that's, you know, the situation changes all the way along. I think that the things that we are working towards at GMP is, of course, we're already working towards not only June, but also looking at working towards AIDS 2018 as once again a part of looking at a revitalized movement for an incredibly neglected region. And we would hope that you would feed into and be aware of thinking about some of the evidence that is coming out of that region. I also think this might be appropriate to tell you some of the changes that are happening about GMP that you might have heard about. We are nearing the end of our search for an ED, with thanks to Javier and Christian's input and the rest of the board. We're looking to have a more operationally involved board, a more skills-based board, a more horizontal and spread out organisation, even though we're only 10 people, so that we're closer to the lived realities of our communities on a more grassroots level. And that's the sort of ED that we are looking for. So I think as the situation changes, we need in all our organisations to be more nimble and agile, to regain some of the things which started the advocacy that got us where we are at now. And I think that GMP and it's under the guidance of its board, it is starting on that sort of journey, and I hope that that will be one that continues, which starts to see us bring back some of those things. I'm sure that in the paper that the little one-pager that we'll be putting out, that will give people who are on this call some ideas. But remember, good ideas come from anywhere. We have no litany or no thing, you know, on the truths. There are many truths out there, but you know, this is the beginning, we hope, of a dialogue and conversation on what we need to do and how we can do it quickly and nimbly and mobilize more people around specific issues that are important to all of us living with HIV, whether they know their status or not. So that's my plug for GNP and the way forward. And I'd also like to thank ICAD for hosting this and being a constant supporter of GMP, which has been really great.
Thanks, Julian. Well, it's a fantastic partnership. So thank you very much for being part of today and for continuing to lead our advocacy movement at a global level. So folks, we've run a little bit over time. I apologize for rushing through things, but please do keep in touch with us. As Julian mentioned, there will be a one-pager that we will put out of some of the key issues that were discussed today and ways in which we can engage. But here up on the screen are also our contact details. So please do feel free to keep in touch, and we will be sure to keep in touch with you. In the meantime, if you have 5 minutes, please let us know what you think about today's session and any further sessions that you would like to see happen. There is the link to a SurveyMonkey. Honestly, it's 5 minutes. Please share your thoughts. All right. So thank you, everybody. Huge thank yous to Christian and Javier for joining us across diverse time zones. Javier, have a very good sleep, and wishing everyone else a very good day, good night, and sweet dreams. Thanks, everyone.